want to talk now about Frederick Douglass, and I was going to jump to what we're doing at the Library Company in African American history that relates to Douglass, but I'm going to step back even further than that, because what we're doing at the Library Company in our program in African American history, which was launched around 2008, is part of a national and global trend. And it comes back to what you're studying here today, and I think Douglass is at the center of it. Because what's happened now is that African Americans, people like Frederick Douglass himself, they are all at the center of our understanding of the abolitionist movement, not just in the North and not just in the United States, but around the world. We know now that the abolitionist movement was always global. It always had networking hotspots in Great Britain, in Western Africa, in the Caribbean. It always included enslaved people trying to get free and free black activists. It always included white reformers. It always included women of color, women at various stations of society. But African Americans are now really the intellectual and activist center of historians, books, articles, the things that they present to teachers, and it wasn't always that way. So our program in African American history really encapsulates that change. When I started in graduate school in the late 80s and early 90s, and I think Joe would echo this, doesn't matter what school you were at, if you were studying the abolitionist movement, you did a couple of things. You looked at the era immediately preceding the Civil War, right? So you looked at the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and you said, out of nowhere, this abolitionist movement appeared, and it kind of put the nation on the path to a destructive sectional conflict. And then, when you located the origins of that movement before the Civil War, you went to New England. And you said it was these New England radicals who were very, very philosophically minded, they were perfectionists, they had this Puritan strain of thinking in which they said, we see sin in the land, it's located in the South, and we're going to call slaveholders sinners, and we're going to stir up all this political ferment, and we're not going to stop until we rout bondage in American culture. So before the Civil War, you get the movement to end slavery, really intensifying. It's located in New England. And then, of course, if you're looking for a figurehead, you look no further than William Lloyd Garrison, the famous editor of The Liberator, who for many people symbolized the potency, commitment, and dynamism of pre-Civil War abolitionism, right? He comes out of this fiery New England tradition. He's sort of like a modern-day Puritan, right? He will speak truth to power. It doesn't matter what happens to him. He puts his life on the line. He is mobbed in Boston when he speaks out against slavery and slave trading. When he publishes his paper, there's a price put on his head in the South. So it's not as if there aren't great reasons to locate this abolitionist struggle in New England. It's not as if there aren't great reasons to say that the abolitionist movement in New England wasn't important. I mean, it's clearly important. And it's not as if there aren't great reasons to say that William Lloyd Garrison isn't the most important abolitionist. He is. He always is important. The problem is that when you did that, you really isolated abolition's impact and culture. You couldn't really explain why a nation that for so long had lived with anti-slavery movements all of a sudden decided we can't live with them anymore, and the South and the North are going to fight over it, right? And we can argue about things like states' rights and the economic origins of the Civil War. Those are important too. But every single argument that is made about Civil War origins in some way, shape, or form comes back to slavery. That's the only thing. You could take every other issue and you can isolate it, and you can say, well, states' rights, it kind of stands on its own. But there's no other issue like slavery that touches everything. It touches culture. It touches identity. It touches constitutionalism, states' rights, economy, right? How does a nation that had lived with people saying slavery's wrong for so long, because the first anti-slavery movements start as soon as the nation does. They start in Pennsylvania with the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in 1775. That's what I wrote my first book on. They're well known. They present petitions to Congress in 1790. South Carolinians in 1790 say, look at those Quakers up there from Philadelphia. They are rabble-rousers, and if they don't stop petitioning to end slavery, we're going to leave the Union. And they get political and economic concessions, right? And so people say, okay, I guess we know how to live with this thing. We marginalize those abolitionists from over there. So how is William Lloyd Garrison different? I mean, that's one big question. But the more important issue then, beyond that, is what else is going on beyond New England? What else is going on in American culture that explains why, after 1830, abolition suddenly becomes such a hot-button issue on all levels? And to do that, to explain its impact, nationally and internationally, you have to come back to African Americans. You have to look at what they're doing in all sectors of society, what they're doing internationally. And Frederick Douglass is just the great example of this, because when he is born in 1818 as an enslaved person in Maryland, slavery is going through a transformation where people who once predicted its death are now trying to get on the bandwagon in the Southwest to join its incredible growth, right? Tobacco and wheat, which had been associated with slavery in Virginia and Maryland for so many years, are now seeing slavery be associated with phenomenal economic growth in the Deep South and the Southwest. And they're looking at new cash crops like sugar. And they're looking especially at cotton. And they're also looking at global markets. And they're looking at the domestic slave trade itself is very important. So from the 1810s to the 1840s, there is this huge rush on anything related to slavery in the Southwest, right? In Louisiana and Mississippi, you're trying to purchase land to convert it into sugar or cotton plantations as fast as you can. In the 1830s, there is no greater kind of boom, bubble, than that which is going on in Mississippi and Louisiana along the Mississippi River, because everyone's trying to invest in slavery. And why are they doing that? Because there's a global boom in cotton production, in sugar production, in coffee production. So scholars now estimate that if you look at slavery as an institution before the Civil War, between the Revolution and the Civil War, but especially in the early 19th century, it becomes the most valuable thing in the American economy, more valuable than anything but land itself. And this is critical, because if you looked at the North and you said, well, what about railroads? What about banks? What about insurance institutions? Surely they're worth more. No, they're not. Slavery's worth more. The South produces, by the Civil War, 75 to 80% of Europe's raw cotton. When you have to think about why the South is going to, parts of the Deep South are going to join the Confederacy, don't think of it as just from a position of weakness. They're afraid of abolitionists. It's from a position of perceived strength. If we leave the Union, we're taking this with us. What are you going to do? So Frederick Douglass, when he is born, sees that economic juggernaut rising up in Maryland. And then he sees the domestic slave trade picking up. 1 million people are transferred from the upper South and the North to the Deep South between the 1790s and the 1850s. So Frederick Douglass knows people in his community who are sold away. And so as he grows up in the 1820s and 30s and moves around different Maryland plantations, he realizes this is a big thing in American life. He also knows that enslaved people are always resisting. He tries to run away several times, and he's caught, but that doesn't deter him. So when he finally does escape, Frederick Douglass tells people on these lecture platforms in the North, throughout the Midwest when he goes on lecture tours later on, off into Europe as we'll see soon, he says, look, what I need to tell you is no one who's enslaved is happy. Some people survive. Some people accommodate. Some people are broken down. But no one wants to be enslaved. So Frederick Douglass becomes a conduit for this ideology in the 1830s and 40s. He doesn't escape fully until around 1838 and then join the abolitionist movement officially until like the early 1840s. But when he does that, he really speaks more powerfully than any other person of African descent to this idea. Enslaved people are always struggling against bondage. And so you always have to look at, say, fugitive slaves or slave rebellions as the proverbial tip of the iceberg, right? There's a slave rebellion in 1822 in Charleston, famously. There's a slave rebellion famously with Nat Turner in 1831 in Virginia. And masters are always wondering, are these isolated? And they try to rationalize to themselves that enslaved people are happy, and rebellions, although they always have to be watchful of them, they're isolated. Right? And Frederick Douglass says, no. Those are just the moments when people pierce the veil of seeming objectification and contentment, and they push out and try to say to the world, we don't want to be enslaved. So Frederick Douglass becomes a metaphor for many scholars of where the heart of the abolition movement is by the third, fourth, and fifth decades of the 1800s. It's powerfully located in communities of color, not only in the enslaved South, but in the North, where you have generations of free blacks who have been trying to publish anti-slavery thoughts. Richard Allen, who was up here as the subject of one of my books, he's a former slave in Delaware. He settles in Philadelphia, founds the AME Church, which has been in the news recently, right? Mother Bethel Church is at 6th and Locust, or 6th and Lombard Streets in Philadelphia. This is the site not only of one of the first free black churches in the Western world, but one of the most powerful abolition centers, because that church as a free black enterprise becomes a sanctuary for white and black activists. So Richard Allen publishes several abolitionist pamphlets against bondage and racial injustice. He hosts traveling lecturers who are speaking on these themes. They come from the Caribbean, from Europe, sometimes from the South. He eulogizes, for example, George Washington in an essay that is eventually republished in newspapers in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. And he says to the rest of the American population, you know, Washington at the end of his life at least had the guts to emancipate people who were in his control and power. And better late than never. And he says, you know, for a Christian nation professing fealty to the Bible, you would all be well to follow Washington's example. So it's a real fire and brimstone kind of lecture. And this tells us that African Americans in the North who have liberated themselves from bondage are also joining the abolition movement. So this is what white reformers see. They see people who don't want to be enslaved. They see people like Richard Allen and Frederick Douglass who move from slavery into what we might call anti-slavery movements. The abolitionist movement initially is a formal enterprise run by whites, and they keep blacks off on the perimeter. And later on, they integrate them into the movement. But white reformers know that Frederick Douglass, Richard Allen, men and women in communities of color are always struggling. They try to infuse the abolitionist movement with that sentimentality and passion after 1830. And so that's the real key to the years before the Civil War. For the first time, the abolition movement formally integrates. When these new abolition societies appear, they argue for immediate and not gradual abolition, which they used to. But more importantly, they say African Americans are co-reformers. So 25% of William Lloyd Garrison's New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1832 is constituted of people of color. They're founding members. And then when Frederick Douglass escapes from slavery, gets up to New Bedford, he reads The Liberator, he says, wow, this is like speaking to my soul. He's reading a newspaper, The Liberator, that is supported by African Americans. William Lloyd Garrison would not have survived as an editor but for the support of African American subscribers in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, other parts of the Atlantic seaboard, Baltimore. I ran through the 1830s, and I found out that his subscriber base is something like 75 to 80% African American. See, so now you can start to put these things together. Oh, this isn't just a generalization. African Americans really are at the center of the abolition movement. And so, in this sense, I'll invite you to think about William Lloyd Garrison as like the nation's first Elvis. It's not that he's not important. It's not that he's not doing something that like lights American culture up. It's just that the way he's doing it is indebted to another community, right? So Elvis Presley's trying to figure out what to do. He's always listening to black radio. He's a truck driver. He shows up in the back of black churches, totally influenced by this. He's in a recording session, famously, right? He's doing all these kind of country tunes and kind of real slow Nashville types tunes, and Sam Phillips just keeps cutting and saying, "This is not the guy I thought I heard. The guy who came into a record store, cut a album for his mother or something like that, and I heard the passion there. And I thought I heard the African-American soul there." And he says, "Let's take a break." And Elvis Presley goes up to a microphone, and he just starts winging, right? What's he sing? That's All Right Mama, I believe, is the first song he sings, which is Otis Blackwell, African-American song. And Sam Phillips comes running into the studio, and he's like jumping over the recording thing, and he's like, "Record, that's what I want." They just start jamming. Right? He finds his African-American groove. And that's the key there. But don't think that Elvis Presley is important if you're saying he just stole it. Yeah, I mean, we know enough about that, to be honest about it. He took it. But he acknowledged his sources, and more importantly, he introduced black music and therefore questions about integration to a whole new audience, right? And so the famous African-American DJ in Memphis, Rufus Thomas, he said there's only two people who can speak to integrated audiences, black and white kids of the 50s who become the activists of the 60s, young people who go to sock hops and there's a dividing line there, white on this side, black on this side, they're listening to Elvis Presley and they're like, just go right through that. Rufus Thomas says two people in America, mid-century, who can speak to integrated audiences without question. One's Martin Luther King, the other is Elvis Presley. You want to think about a civil rights movement, you just got to think about that. And that's going back to William Lloyd Garrison in the 1830s. His subscriber base is African American, which means he's got to appeal to them. He has a significant number of African American writers, people who write in. A man of color is James Fortin from Philadelphia, who's a famous black activist, been around for generations. He kind of advises William Lloyd Garrison on what to do, and he contributes these essays. So William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper looks and feels like it has an African-American base of support. And this is what Frederick Douglass sees. So then let's complete the scenario. When Frederick Douglass comes up to Massachusetts as a runaway in the 1830s, in New Bedford, he picks up the Liberator and he joins the cause, goes to an anti-slavery meeting. He's asked to get up and speak. Hey, you're a former slave. Do you think you could speak about what it's like to be enslaved? He gets up and he speaks. William Lloyd Garrison just drops his pen. He says, in the introduction to Frederick Douglass's autobiography in 1845, which I'm sure most of you read because they see your heads nodding, he says, "I never hated slavery as much as at that moment when Frederick Douglass got up and spoke, not just with passion, but with power, eloquence." Right? Because Frederick Douglass had learned to read. He had studied great orators from the Columbian Orator, right? So, it's kind of like those people who always want to be radio DJs or sports announcers, like when they're 4 years old, they're in the backyard narrating to the birds about what happened. So Frederick Douglass is doing in the backyards of slavery. He's always pretending to be the one-time great orator he thinks he will be if he can escape slavery. And he gets the chance at an anti-slavery meeting. And Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison and all these other white reformers who'd been in the movement for several years are blown away. So at all those levels, you see African Americans absolutely central. They help co-found this new era of radical anti-slavery. They support William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper. They write for him. Then they inspire him anew when they become lecturers. Because most of the lecturers in the 1830s are white. There's only one or two who are African American. Frederick Douglass becomes the most powerful anti-slavery lecturer, not only in the nation, but in the world before the Civil War. And from the moment he speaks before this anti-slavery group in New England, until he dies, he is the most famous reformer of the 19th century. You may know this. I will say it here. because I think it encapsulates what I'm talking about in so many ways. There are more pictures of Frederick Douglass than Abraham Lincoln in the 19th century. And you might say right off the bat, well, of course, because he lived longer. But that's not necessarily so. There are more pictures in the 1840s of Frederick Douglass than Abraham Lincoln. Why? Because Abraham Lincoln is a country lawyer off in the sticks of Illinois, when Frederick Douglass is a ramifying reformer stirring up all sorts of fermented trouble in New York, New England, parts of the Midwest. Then he goes to Europe. He's a celebrity as well as a rabble-rouser wherever he goes, because people want to see this powerful person. And I brought a copy of his third autobiography. This is an original copy of Life and Times, which I bought here in Rochester. It's illustrated. It's awesome. I'll read to you a little bit about what he says about Rochester, because we're going to get to why Rochester is important. We're getting to why Douglass and African Americans are important. But in here, Douglass has this great vignette where he says, when I settled in Rochester, people would always come to visit me. Runaway slaves, fellow abolitionists. He said, but you know what? A lot of slaveholders would vacation in Niagara Falls, because in the days before air conditioning, you came up to the north, if you were from the south, to get away from the heat and the pestilence. So you went to Saratoga Springs, you went to wherever there were springs in the north, or you went to New Hampshire, Vermont, where it was cooler, or you went to Niagara Falls, where there's this great spectacle. And trains and canals will now take you there more easily than ever before. And you know what? Frederick Douglass says, I'll be darned. Slaveholders often come from Niagara Falls to Rochester, and they look me up because I'm the editor of the North Star now, and they say, just wanted to see if it was really, if you could really read and write. Just checking you out here. Not trying to, steal you back to slavery or anything like that. Just checking you out. So once again, to say that there are more pictures of Douglass than of Lincoln suggests that even before Lincoln was president, Douglass was more famous. And then afterwards, he remains a reformer. So all throughout his life, people want to capture his image. So in Frederick Douglass, once again, you see why African American history is so important and why blacks are now the center of abolitionist historiography. If you go to professional conferences, that's what you will see is more scholars doing more research, presenting more books and panels on African American history, reform, abolition than ever before. So that is really significant. But borrowing from Frederick Douglass after the Civil War, let's get to the lesson of the hour now. Why Rochester? Why Frederick Douglass in Rochester? What does he do here that is so important? What can you take away from your time here that will translate into really powerful and compelling classroom segments? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, we're back to place. And so you did the Erie Canal tour. You've been here for a couple of days. You've heard about millennialism and Rochester as a reform center. All of that goes into why Rochester becomes a powerful part of the abolition movement and why Frederick Douglass comes to Rochester. This is the new it place in the middle of the 19th century. This is where reformers come to start or restart their great reform movements, whatever it is, women's rights reform, religious reform, labor reform, struggles against racial injustice, the abolition movement. So much of that centers on Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, because of what the Erie Canal has already done. It's allowed people to see a new way of looking at the world and the universe, right? The things you've already talked about. When you say to people, we have changed God's world, right? We have changed the earth with this canal and put a 363-mile river there. The great being or God or whatever you believe in didn't have the foresight to put something. You are saying something powerful to people. You're in control. And if you're in control of the world to that extent, you can change things like the institution of slavery, like women's place in society, right? Like the way that laborers fit, get paid, do whatever in society. So all up and down the Erie Canal, you see these vibrant reform movements, right? The Oneida Community, which is a little further east, right? That's a model perfectionist community that's aimed at what? Reconstituting human relations. Can you imagine saying to someone, well, what we're going to do in our reform movement is reconstitute human relations? You go, what do you mean? Well, you know, like the way that men and women, the way that families operate. You go, get out of here. You got to pay your mortgage. You got to feed yourself, right? You have more worldly concerns. But that's the way people are thinking, because the canal has totally revolutionized their mindsets. Most people did not travel before the Erie Canal and the 19th century transportation revolution. They didn't travel beyond where they were born, maybe 5 miles, maybe if you were lucky, 20 miles. Now the Erie Canal says, guess what? If you're born on a small farm in western Massachusetts and you don't see opportunity, you can just go up and down the Erie Canal now in the 1820s and 30s. Why don't you go to Troy? Nothing happening there? Go to Rochester. You don't like it there after a couple of years? Go to Buffalo. So the famous statistic is there are more people coming to Rochester than are leaving in any year. And then my joke is, or maybe it's the other way around, right? The point is Rochester, like Syracuse, like Buffalo, like all Erie Canal towns, is now a transient place. And again, that allows people to think of their world differently, and it also allows them to think about reform now. With so much transience and change and movement, we've got to reform things. And so that's why you bring Finney here. And then when you bring Finney here, you got more reformers here. You say, what else can we do? And you get, abolitionist reformers and labor reformers and women's rights reformers. But there's something else that's important for Rochester and abolition. Got your maps up here? It's very close to an international border. At this time, the international border is not Canada, Ontario in Canada. It's Upper Canada in the British domain. And by the 1830s, although even before, the British Empire has gotten rid of bondage. 1834 marks the official end of slavery everywhere in the British Empire, and it's 70 miles away from Rochester. So Frederick Douglass in Life and Times, he says, when I brought fugitive slaves to freedom, I brought them to Ontario, British Canada very often. And he says the conduit was not only the Erie Canal, but the free waters of Lake Ontario. It's a marvelous phrase, right? Once you get to the Niagara River or to Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, if you have to go that way, you say to yourself, those are free waters. And that is a magical way of thinking, because even in the North, with fugitive slave laws that you all know about and teach about, right? First one is 1793. It says masters have the right to get runaway slaves back. Doesn't matter what kind of conscience you have in the North. If an enslaved person runs from Maryland to Pennsylvania, you got to return him or her. Then that's strengthened in 1850 to the point where if you don't help, you could be in trouble. You could end up in prison as a white or black person in the so-called free North. You could be fined. So Frederick Douglass really values that international border, just like a lot of abolitionists do. There's a huge free black community there. By the Civil War era, the Lincoln administration begins studying this community of free blacks in Upper Canada, Canada West, St. Catharines, Toronto, places over by Detroit, Chatham, and some of their statistics are really powerful. It's somewhere between 20 and 30,000 in number, and 3/4 by the Civil War era come from the United States South. So Frederick Douglass, once again, is not just generalizing and saying something for propaganda purposes. When he says, those free waters of Lake Ontario are a great and wonderful sight to the eyes of any fugitive, he was speaking of truth. But most importantly, what happens in the 1840s is Frederick Douglass realizes that he needs to find a new and vibrant place to situate himself, because after being with New England abolitionists for a couple of years, he feels as if he is under their thumb. He feels as if he's being treated paternalistically. He feels as if the kind of tutelage that he's gone through is somewhere between kind of schoolmaster and pupil, or something a little more dire, right? That he, if he really thinks about it, will never be treated equally as an activist. So for example, he says, when I lecture around New England, parts of New York, white abolitionists often say to me, you get up there and do your little song and dance. This is how bad slavery is. This is how, we're whipped. You do all the physical stuff, Fred, and we'll do the philosophy. That's his famous quote, right? They'll talk about what immediatism means philosophically. We'll talk about anti-slavery tactics. Garrisonians, for example, believe that politics and the political system is corrupt, and you cannot participate in it lest you participate in corruption. Frederick Douglass, by the mid-1840s, is saying, why? If we want to change power relations and get rid of bondage nationally, maybe those abolitionists who dissent from Garrison should be heard. And Garrison says, no! What do we tell you, Frederick Douglass? We'll talk about the philosophy. You just do your little song and dance. And Frederick Douglass says, all right. Along the way, as he gives these lecture tours, Douglass also realizes that his education beyond bondage, that his popularity on the lecture circuit, these things are pointing him in a new direction. He's got a bigger destiny than to be an associate of William Lloyd Garrison. No matter how much he's inspired him, Frederick Douglass says to William Lloyd Garrison, I want to go off on my own. What if I want to be like the nation's leading abolitionist? What if I think I have something equally powerful to say? Not more powerful, equally powerful to say. Garrison's like, come on, dude, I'm the man, right? And so there's a tension in the abolitionist movement between white and black abolitionists that Douglass is speaking to, and the problem is that Garrison, for all of his wonderful commitments, for putting his life on the line, it's not enough because he doesn't see it. He thinks, I've been put here on this earth to do this great work, just like many of those millennials, right? And it pervades his being, and in a sense blinds him to some of the paternalistic practices that he employs. And there are other African Americans in the movement who speak to this, and this is a timeless issue in racial reform movements, right down to the present day. And all I would say is, that's why we study the past in movements, because we learn from them, and we also realize that movements to change the world, by their definition, whether you're a conservative activist trying to change the world or a liberal activist, there's stress and pressure on it, right? And the longer you're in a movement to change the world without that change happening, the more the stress builds up, and the more these kind of side issues come out. And so you could say maybe that's the way it'll always be, and you can just confront that stuff truthfully. If you go back and you look at it, you say, well, of course, Garrison's doing something vital. But so is Frederick Douglass. And so Frederick Douglass says, you know what? I think I need a breather. And that brings us to the first document you have in front of you. He goes to Europe, specifically Great Britain. And Joe, you're going to take some of these and hand them out? Great. So this comes from the Frederick Douglass Project. This is just one page. If you take it and turn it back. The Frederick Douglass Project at the University of Rochester is a collected writings project because they have several wonderful volumes of Douglass's original writings, which you will see later. And they did some online production of these things. And so now they have a really great cache of documents for your use from the 1840s through the Civil War era. In other words, Douglass's roughly 25 years in Rochester. They also have reproductions of some of his most famous writings. He publishes 3 papers in Rochester. But again, we got to get him to Rochester. So here is a letter that he writes to a Rochester area activist, Amy Post, who's here with her husband. He's a druggist. Doesn't mean the same thing then as now. It's sort of like a kind of early pharmacist. But these 2 people are committed millennial reformers who participate in every kind of reform movement imaginable in Rochester. And Douglass has already been here to Western New York in the early 1840s. And he starts to think to himself, when he's in Europe, about returning and where he might go to create an individualistic kind of place for himself where he can grow as a reformer beyond Garrison. And so he engages in this correspondence with Amy Post. And I want you to read through this letter, and if you would for me, just pick out, so we can get a little discussion going, what you think is the most important phrase or word in this correspondence. Remember, this is the most famous fugitive slave in the world writing to a white female abolitionist, and she's located in Rochester. And it's not that long, keyword or phrase. Douglass is taking a break, he's gone to Europe. The real reason he goes to Europe is he's become so famous, especially after publishing his first autobiography in 1845, and his face is everywhere, that he's worried, and his friends are worried that he's going to be recaptured by his former master. Price put on his head, and he's going to be returned to Maryland, so he goes to Europe. That's where he writes this letter. If you haven't finished up. And it's funny, I heard that muffled crying when I was speaking, and I thought, wow, am I already making people cry in here? Anyone need more time? So again, Douglass is over in Europe, mostly in the British Isles. He's escaped because he's a wanted man, but he's now going to come back, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and he's going to have to come back somewhere. But let's talk about this letter, because it tells us about his mindset when he's going to come back. So what words or phrases did you pick out, and what does this tell us? Yes?
I think the most important, for me, I am treated as a man,
yes,
an equal brother.
So he goes over to Europe to get away from the arm of slave catchers and take a breather. But what he finds in Europe, where, again, slavery's been eradicated, he says, I'm finding them treated equally. Great start. So his mind is being revolutionized by egalitarian treatment. Other phrases, words, yeah.
He says, I am fearful that I will be unfit for slavery.
Wow. Now this is interesting. So he's thinking of coming back, but what does this phrase tell us about coming back? What does he mean? Like, I think I will be unfit to come back to the pro-slavery United States.
It can mean a lot of things. It can mean the fact that he is seen as an equal. Why would I give this up?
Right. I don't know if I want to give it up, but also in a way, and we have to be careful when we're talking to our students especially, but I think I've grown soft in a way. Can you imagine what it would be like to be literally bought and sold, right? His mother, he never sees her again after a final encounter when he's very young and she walks off. I mean, I almost break into tears thinking about it right now, right? Like, you're impressionable when you're 4, 5, 6, whatever the age is. And Douglass learns that his mother is working on another plantation, and then she just stops showing up one day. It's like, bye-bye. And he puts the pieces together later that she loved him so much. She walked, 8 or 10 miles a day or 12 miles a day. And then basically, she was separated from him, sold off. So you go from that to you run away and then you go to Europe and people are treating you equal. Totally equal. So the great example of this in Frederick Douglass's autobiography again, which I come back to whenever I'm teaching, is he's in England and he's standing outside of the House of Parliament and he's talking to a member of the House of Lords. Not even the House of Commons, but the Lords, right? Hereditary peers. Lifetime peers, meaning you're in office forever because of the land and family standing you've had. It's changed a little now, but this is big stuff, and he's just sitting out there jawing with someone, and this doctor from Boston, this white dude, comes up to him and he says, "Hey, Fred, could you introduce me to him, that lord in Parliament?" And Frederick Douglass writes scathingly in his autobiography, "That guy wouldn't have even given me the time of day. Might have done something worse if we were in Boston. But now over here, because of the social situation, that's the way we play it out? Oh my God. So I'm a little worried when I go back to the United States. I'm not ready for the fight." Okay, a couple other things before we get to Douglass and Rochester.
About the repetition of the idea and the concept of brotherhood,
Yes.
family, love.
He talks about that.
Trying to maybe envisioning reconstituting
Right.
that in Rochester.
And you're seeing why Rochester is so important, because in this person, Amy Post, and the family of Isaac and Amy Post, he is seeing the new possibilities, as you say, of reconstituting anti-slavery family and brotherhood. Maybe on an equal basis, right? And he emphasizes that a couple times, so already in his mind, he's thinking Rochester, new beginning. Rochester, new beginning. Rochester, new beginning. And this is not for propaganda purposes necessarily, although the letter will clearly be shared. You can say it starts as a private correspondence, which tells you that Douglass really believes in it. Okay, one more. Let's get one more comment here from someone who hasn't spoken yet. Yeah.
I'm struck by how he talks about the relationship between slavery and his poor treatment. And it seems like he insinuates that he's excited for the day that slavery ends because then his poor treatment in America will end. And it's
Right.
such an optimistic thought. And knowing how it plays out, it's really,
Yeah.
it's like kind of about
It's, great points all around, and this kind of rounds them out, because you're getting into the mindset of abolitionists who, of course realize that racial prejudice is a big problem, but the big, huge monster in the room of the United States is bondage. And Douglass really hopes, if he doesn't fervently believe, that if we get slavery out of the way, if we can rout bondage, maybe we will have a new day of race relations. And of course, he's already seen it in Great Britain, right? So the English were slave traders. They didn't outlaw the slave trade until 1807. Slavery kind of died a slow death in England itself. And there were problems. Douglass is putting rose-tinted glasses on this. Blacks can definitely find trouble if they want it in the British Isles. But relative to the United States, it is a haven. And so Douglass is thinking, they got rid of the slave trade, then they got rid of slavery in 1834 and all their colonial possessions. Maybe that's the key. Get rid of the idea that enslaved people are property and African Americans are destined to be that property, and you have a pathway to egalitarianism. Later on, he will, I think, concede after the Civil War. All right, it's a much bigger job than we anticipated, but here, I think you're seeing the hopefulness of Douglass at a key moment in his life, right? If we can come back together as an anti-slavery family in a place like Rochester, get everyone's attention on bondage, right? Fight it from all these angles. Get Garrison in New England, we'll do it in New York, we'll get folks in Canada, right? Then we can get rid of the bugaboo of slavery.
I have a question. On the back page, he talks about being there with two others and you were in a lecture.
Yeah.
Because of pro-slavery conduct of the Free Church of Scotland.
Yeah.
So,
Well, so here we are. We're back to a kind of moment where Douglass is maybe a little more realistic than his comments in this letter, what it suggests. The Free Church of Scotland is one of these evangelical churches, and it has great connections to all the millennial movements that you've been studying about in the United States. But it's taking money from slaveholding churches and donors in the United States. And this becomes a big cause célèbre because African Americans and white abolitionists in Europe say, do you know what's going on over here? The Free Church of Scotland is taking blood money. And so, the anti-slavery press in the United States really makes this into an international issue. And Douglass is one of the people who's the eyes and ears for this problem in Scotland. And they try to whip up people into a frenzy so that the Free Church of Scotland will return the money. And they have a lot of debates. The Free Church of Scotland doesn't do that, but this kind of redounds to the abolitionist credit because it shows that the tentacles of not only slavery but racial injustice are long and firm. And so I think here Douglass already realizes that you can be in a place like Scotland where you are seemingly beyond the clutches of bondage, and yet doesn't mean that slaveholders trying to sway or racial injustice still can't be prevalent in some way, shape, or form, because this colors, pun intended, the way that some members of the Free Church of Scotland look at people of color. You're rabble-rousers. You're whipping up all this trouble. Why don't you just go home and deal with your own problems? So I think this is a neat point because it shows that Douglass is aware that the world is more complex. But for our purposes, it's important to get Douglass back to Rochester, and so let's do that right now, because what Douglass is doing in this letter is he's setting up the move to the United States. And he's saying to Amy Post, you know what, I'm really thinking now not only about coming back to the U.S., but about my independent life there, and I can't do it back in Boston. I feel like the shadow of Garrison and Garrisonians is too large. There are many African Americans there who like Garrison, and so I wouldn't be able to be truly independent. And as I think about the United States and where the hot reform centers are and where, great reformers are and where I could reconstitute this anti-slavery family best, it's Rochester. That's what he's kind of doing in this letter. And you see it at the very end of the note, right, where he says, in no uncertain terms, I am now in Edinburgh, Scotland. It is a beautiful city. The most beautiful, I even say, not so much on account of the buildings as on account of its picturesque position. So I'm loving it, but I'm going to have to come back home, dear Amy. And I'm thinking about my anti-slavery family in Rochester, as he puts it in the very last paragraph. And I'm going to be there in a few months. And aren't you excited? And we're going to build on the movements that are already there. And the key to this move back to the United States and to Rochester in particular is that British friends, Quakers in Britain, buy Douglass out of bondage. You see, it's not the Garrisonians who liberated him. It's not his U.S. friends. Douglass feels that it's safe to go back for one reason. Because Ellen Richardson, a friend and Quaker reformer in England, has gotten up a collection. They've reached out through an intermediary in Pennsylvania to Douglass's Maryland master, and they say, here's what we'll do. We'll give you this money. We'll give it to you in pounds sterling. You get cash, right? We just want Douglass's life and body. And when Garrison and the Garrisonians hear about this, they're a little deflated. Frederick, we thought we knew you. You know what? This is like anti-slavery politics. By buying yourself out of freedom, you have reified bondage as a legal institution, right? Because now the world says it's legitimate. You didn't run away and say, F you, slavery and slaveholders, you don't own me, no one owns me. And you have to argue from a certain philosophical perspective. It makes sense, right? But for many African Americans, and this gets back to the historiographical change that I've been telling you about, for many African Americans, the finer points of philosophy are not as important as practical reality, safety. So here we can flip, Douglass's naivete in his head. Isn't Garrison being naive by saying, Wow. You have a chance to get your freedom, but you shouldn't take it because it will uphold slavery's meaning in law and society. Douglass, like a lot of African Americans, says, well before Malcolm X, by any means available, by any means necessary. If you're going to come and take me and my family, even though I'm a runaway, you better be prepared when you walk through that door, we're going. And Garrisonians, they debate it. They do debate it. But they will often say, you see, we're pietists. We believe in the purity of the moral movement. Don't use physical means. So Garrison will say, we understand why Nat Turner rebelled. It's just that's not going to get you anywhere practically. And, it's going to turn into a bloodbath. And Douglass says sometimes, why not? Someone's coming after you. What are you going to do? You take your child out of your home? You sit there and go, according to philosophy, I shouldn't do anything. You're going to go after them. You're going to start swinging. Pacifist though you might be. And so Douglass, a lot of African Americans say, it's too specialized a brand of thinking. So Douglass, of course, grants this contract, and he comes back, and so he gets as far away from the Garrisonians as possible. And again, I want to emphasize that there's a real debate here. At one point, Douglass himself is a pure Garrisonian. In Buffalo, in 1843, the Black Convention, Henry Highland Garnett, fellow fugitive slave from Maryland, he gets up and says, I got this lecture to enslave people I want us to publish. And it says, you go to your masters, and you say, I read the Declaration of Independence. I'm entitled to my freedom. I'm walking off the plantation right now. What are you going to do? And Garnett's address says, if they come after you, you do what you got to do. But it's your right to go. And there's this huge debate in the black community about physical violence, because some, even though they embrace it, say it won't work. You just don't have the numbers. And Douglass is sort of on that line, but he's also a moralistic reformer in his way of Garrisonians. He opposes, in 1843, Henry Highland Garnett's attempt to publish that address. It does not get published until 5 years later. And so that's why when Frederick Douglass comes back, there are some African Americans who are going, okay, Fred, you a politician or you're a reformer? What do you really believe? But the point is, he comes back to Rochester, and now, in Rochester, he is going to start a newspaper as the fountainhead of his abolitionist reform movement that speaks to his ideology. He's going to do a couple of things here when he's in Rochester. Number one, he is going to work with any reformer who will work with him, but mostly he's going to make the North Star, his famous publication, which he launches in 1847, a vehicle for free black thinking and thought. So it's going to feature attacks on slavery, but it's going to feature also a diversity of opinion on how to attack slavery, including that from a variety of free black activists. So one of the people he gets to work with him in Rochester is Martin Delany, who is a free black person from Western Virginia, moves around in black and abolitionist reform circles, comes to work with Frederick Douglass. So he's got an African-American kind of assistant editor underneath him. And you know what Delany comes to embrace? Black nationalism. He says by the 1850s, I don't think we can ever reform American society. The best thing that African Americans can do is get out of here and go to Central America or Western Africa or the Caribbean or Canada. They have to go to a place where they have numerical power and therefore political supremacy, because that's the key to the world. What did the Puritans do? They got out of an area where their way of looking at the world wasn't in favor, and they were persecuted, and they came to an area where they could do their own thing. Douglass disagrees with Delany. Douglass says, I don't agree with you. We got to stay here and fight and make America a colorblind society. But eventually Delany says, I don't agree with you either, and he goes on, publishes his own paper. But you see, Douglass says, I can tolerate this diversity. So he says the North Star will be a vehicle for free black thinking. Within abolitionist circles, too, he says, I'm going to embrace, especially later on in his second publication, Frederick Douglass's paper, he's going to embrace different views of politics and the Constitution. The Garrisonians say politics is corrupt, and so is the Constitution. Compact with hell, covenant with death. It's a slaveholder's constitution. There are white as well as black abolitionists. particularly in the 1840s, who disagree, and Douglass goes over to their side by the late 1840s and 50s. And he says, I don't think that the Constitution is a slaveholder's document. In fact, and he says this in Life and Times when he's going back to there, he says, in fact, I think that the Constitution is an anti-slavery document. He says, look at the preamble, the general welfare clauses, the elastic clauses. They all talk about grand liberty as the end result of the Constitution. So it's as if the Declaration was integrated into the Constitution, right? General welfare. What is in the general welfare and interest of the United States? He says, clearly not slavery. That's a bad institution. It skews American values. We say that we're liberty-loving people, but we're the largest slaveholding power in the world. If you look around the world by the 1850s, the United States is clear and above the other two large slaveholding powers, Spanish Cuba and Brazil. And if you add up the number of enslaved people they have by the Civil War, not as much as the United States, 4 million people and growing. The trade in human flesh, the domestic slave trade, which took 1 million people from the upper South to the lower South, he says that's a violation of human rights. And so that violates the general welfare clause. But there are other parts of the Constitution, too, that he says should not sanction bondage. And he says, by the way, slavery's not mentioned in the Constitution. So let's just give the founders the benefit of the doubt. He also says politics should not be thought of as corrupt. As a matter of fact, if we don't run political parties, if we don't participate in politics, we're part of the problem. Let's embrace third-party politics, like the Liberty Party, or the Free Soil Party, or eventually, even though Douglass goes back and forth on it, the Republican Party. But let's be, as an abolitionist constituency, a group within the political universe that says you've got to make abolition and anti-slavery a part of your political process. Else slavery will expand and expand and expand, and we will have no one to blame but ourselves. So that's the second way in which Douglass makes the North Star, and therefore Rochester, a site for new thinking under the sun. Third thing he does is he makes Rochester, more than ever before, an entrepreneur of the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass, in Life and Times and in other places, talks about being a station master on the Underground Railroad. He's proud to say that he never lost a fugitive that was put in his care. Very, very important. Fourthly, he really elevates the struggle against racial injustice in Rochester to an equal plane with the struggle against slavery. And it's back to the question here. And he does this because when he comes back to Rochester and he tries to put his daughter into school here, there's at least one family, maybe a few more, who object, and they segregate his daughter. And so he has to go to Rochester educators, Rochester newspaper editors, beyond the North Star, and he say, this is wrong. So he's always fighting for equality. And he gets the schools, in some cases, integrated. And he gets Rochesterians to think about their grand millennial and reform ideals on a whole other practical plane. And he feels like in Boston, some of those issues have been settled, but he also feels like, it's tough to talk to Garrisonians about some of those things. So he can do that here as a leader. So over and over again, you see Douglass is right for Rochester, and Rochester is right for Douglass, because he feels free and clear to talk about these things in a way that is unobstructed from other reformers. And that brings us to the second document. So it's now 1853. Joe will hand out a document to you that shows you Frederick Douglass at the height of his fame. After around 6 years, Douglass is the acknowledged leader of Rochester reformers, but more than that, he's the most famous abolitionist in the country. So there's always a price put on Douglass's head when he speaks. There's always some disturbance. He talks about traveling around and, having people threaten to mob him. It's something that Douglass grows used to. All abolitionists have to grow used to. But it's gone beyond that in the 1850s. You see, Douglass is the big bogeyman to slaveholders and others around the country. So I used this example last week. Nathan Bedford Forrest, right? Fighter in the Confederacy. He's the founder, one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. He's a slave trader before the Civil War. You know, just be very honest about these things. And Nathan Bedford Forrest, according to one scholar who I was talking to a couple of weeks ago, actually uses Frederick Douglass's fame to try to sell an enslaved child in his possession. He puts out an ad saying, and she is the alleged daughter of none other than Frederick Douglass. It's a public does, right? But if you're looking beyond that kind of veneer of lurid tales, Douglass is the person who scares people because he's not afraid to talk about these things and travel around and speak about them in ways that are very practical, right? So when he's talking about anti-slavery politics or an anti-slavery constitution, it's a little more palpable and therefore threatening than Garrison. Garrison's threatening, but it's more just as a general representative of Northern radicalism. Douglass, he can stir up runaway slaves. He's talking about infiltrating the political system. He's mobilizing people now to vote for anti-slavery figures, and guess what? It impacts national politics. In the election of 1844, and in the election of 1848, abolitionists who vote for the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party, they take the presidency essentially out of the hands of the Whig candidate, Henry Clay. Something you probably teach about all the time. But there's enough voters who stray from the Whig Party into these third-party experiments with abolitionism that you don't get those New York votes. And there are people who write up or write down to political figures nationally from New York. They're white figures. They're anti-abolitionists. They say, you know, the free black population here, they're really mobilized. They have the power to sway white voters. They're starting to impact politics. Do not underestimate this. So when Garrison says, you know what, we don't want to participate in politics, it's sort of music to the ears of slaveholders and stuff. Like, thank God we have to pay attention to you people. But when Douglass does so in New York, the largest by population and economic power state in the Union, holy crap. And when Douglass finally visits Abraham Lincoln in the White House, does it 3 times, you know what Lincoln says to him the first time? Douglass talks about it in Life and Times. We have verification of this. He goes to Frederick Douglass and he says, I know you. I've read you. You don't like me. You've made some pretty withering comments about my soft abolitionism. But can you imagine that? Going to the White House? Can any of you imagine that? Go to the White House like, I know you. Joe Torre, I know you. I've been reading you up at Brockport. You'd be like, holy crap, and I didn't even vote for you, Mr. President, right? Whoever it is. That's amazing. That's Douglass. Just absolutely unthinkable. So Douglass has power, and here he is in 1853. We're going to end with this, but we're going to talk about it for about 10 minutes. 1853 is at the height of his powers. Now this is a year after his famous What to the Slave is the 4th of July, which I bet many of you teach and most of you know. But here's Douglass a year later hosting a convention of black abolitionists from around the country in Rochester, and this is his grand kind of farewell address to those delegates going back. He writes this, he gives the address. Would you just read the first 2 paragraphs of this address and tell me what stands out to you? I think, Joe, you're putting it up?
Yeah, it's up right there as
Yep,
well.
first 2 paragraphs, real quick. And then we'll end with some of the resolutions down low. What stands out to you about these first 2 paragraphs of this address? two paragraphs, what stands out to you, what strikes you? Do you need more time? Real quickly, what stands out to you? Yes.
I think there was sort of the sense of solidarity, and there was one line saying, we point to your principles, your wisdom,
Yes.
your great example as the full
Right.
justification. So right back at you, here are all your principles,
I love it.
let's make good on them.
Yes, and I love that idea of solidarity, like, we are in the city of Rochester, but we're boldly declaring these principles to you unanimously and proudly. So he is confident. Good. What else? What else stands out?
His historical consciousness,
Yep.
again, it reminds me of Lincoln.
Yep.
Putting things into that historical
Yeah.
context, reminding us of what it means
Great point.
to be a true American.
In that second paragraph, what do we talk about, right? He has turned around his thinking on the Constitution. He's integrated the Declaration into the Constitution. So he talks about all men created equal, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But he also talks about, the Constitution is sort of a vehicle for protecting justice, promoting the general welfare, securing the blessings of liberty, right? It's the way that you make practical and real all those wonderful universal values of the Declaration. He's confident enough now in Rochester to say, we believe this, right? It's a declaration. It's not a question. And for those of you thinking about the way to put this together with what to the slave was the 4th of July, you could argue that that's a masterful performance, but he's still not done with his education, right? This, I would say, is his valedictory address to America after 6 years. And he says over and over again, remember, I only got out of slavery in 1838. I've been in school since then, right? It was like I went through 9 years of common school, then I went to undergrad, now I'm in grad school. This is my PhD thesis. And so in 1852, what to the slaves, his final questioning is like, a graduate student, do I believe this or do I believe this? Remember, Douglass loves Shakespeare, reads Hamlet, right? So, what to the slaves is the 4th of July? Is it your holiday or my holiday? I'm not sure. Am I a rhetorical speaker who's making you uncomfortable because I don't believe in these things? Or do I really believe that America's your country and I'm going to leave, so I'm just sticking it to you before I go, right? He's performing, he's questioning, but in this address, there's no questioning. Here's what we believe. The Declaration and the Constitution are one. They promote justice, equality, everything that abolitionists stand for. Any of you focus in on the very first word at the top? Very first phrase? Fellow citizens. 5th of July address, remember? Famously, the first of the reversals, he starts out by saying, I'm here to talk about the revolution. He says, whoa, why'd you all invite me here? I'm not a fellow citizen, it's the battle of the pronouns. It's your holiday, not mine. Right? You can be happy, I should be sad. Then his second reversal is, yeah, but we'll all come together and we'll fight slavery. It's great. But here, right off the bat, what's the first phrase? Fellow citizens! I'm claiming it. I'm a voter in New York. I own property in New York, and I can vote. You're not taking this away from me, because the founders and the Declaration entitle me to it. No ambivalence. There's just strategical thinking, and that's where, if you go to the second paragraph, he says, as an apology, to white citizens in the greater Rochester audience or nationally, we do need your help because slavery and racial injustice are these very powerful institutions and ways of thinking, but note again and again the confidence. Anything else stand out to you all when you look at these first two paragraphs?
And the spirit of patriotic goodwill.
Yeah.
It's very contrasting to.
Yeah. I'm just going to say, this is what we're doing here. We're trying to make America the best place, the best representative democracy in the world. And so we're going to say that's our belief. Now you got to make it happen by joining us.
And I like the last sentence, you know, I will not, yet we will not attempt to repress the spirit
Yeah.
of liberty.
Again.
You know, and this is our sense of justice and integrity. We
Absolutely.
will stand.
Confidence, we shall affect no especial timidity, no ambivalence, we're going for it.
I just have a question. Lincoln's frame of silver, apple, gold speech. Is that before this, or is this
That's a
after?
great question. You know, the bigger point is, whenever it happened, before or after, the bigger point is that Lincoln, into the early 1850s, is still trying to form his thought in relation to the Whig Party. He's a Whig before he's a Republican, and the Whigs are famous for speaking with multiple tongues, right? The Whigs in the North say, we don't like slavery and we might do some things about it, and then Whigs in the South say, we don't like abolitionists, we're going to say some things about it, and we dare people to put the two strands together, compare notes. But here's Douglass saying, oh, for God's sake, here's the deal. Boom, confident. And I think it's fair to say that people like Douglass are already going to influence Lincoln. Follow up and then end up over here.
Yeah, I was just thinking that he's elevating. I mean, it seems like he's elevating the status of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
I mean,
True.
Before this.
Yeah, and there's a lot of thinking in abolitionism that's doing that, but what I think is really key here is note the way in that second paragraph that it's the Declaration and the Constitution mingling, right?
And I don't think before in this time period I think we take for granted that the Declaration of Independence
Okay.
is its national creed.
Fair point, fair
so
point.
I guess my question is, to what extent is that our present day narrative of the
Yeah.
Declaration being our statement of belief?
Yeah.
Um,
There's other
he's
abolitionists,
shaping it.
and there are some thinkers who are doing it. What I would just say is Douglass is a key part of that intellectual movement. So maybe that's a way we can come together. Because I'd have to go back and look at the speech you're citing and see when it is, and there's a lot of Whig thinking, but even slaveholders are citing the Declaration, so a lot of people are throwing it around. But I think there's a virtuosity with which Douglass and his brand of reformers are deploying it that is noteworthy, right? Like, it's seamless. They're not just saying the Declaration is in the Constitution, here's one catchphrase. They are making it work. Like, what does general welfare mean? Let's pick it apart. What's equal justice mean? Let's pick it apart. So it's well to think again of African Americans, not just as the activists who get on stage and go, I was whipped this many times, but as thinkers. That's something that's really key. Good point. Hand up over here.
Oh, this is just a connection, actually. There's a Langston Hughes poem called Let America Be America.
Yes.
Again, the
Yes.
land that never has been yet.
Yes.
And this, I'm just seeing,
Yeah, he figures it. And in that poem, what's so noteworthy is Langston Hughes says, let America be America again, and it's in parentheses, and he says, America never was America to me. It's like a little aside. Here, there's no aside, there's no parentheses. Douglass says, I am America, fellow citizens. And look at that third paragraph. We are Americans. And as Americans, we speak to Americans. We address you not as aliens. This is a great time of immigration, the beginnings of more types of diverse immigration than ever before. And Douglass is saying, you're treating them more equally than us? My family's been here for a couple of generations, enslaved though we have been and now free. Aren't we entitled to all these rights and liberties? So again, bold, confident claims. This is Douglass in Rochester, not an apprentice or an assistant, a true schoolmaster. And let's just do this here. Can we go down to the list of phrases here? Can we go each table, read one? I'll just take that one of you will sort it out. So we asked that in our native language. Can someone read that? We'll go this table and just across here.
We ask that in our native land, we shall not be treated as strangers and worse than strangers.
Thank you.
We ask that being friends of America, we should not be treated as enemies of America.
Thank you.
We ask that speaking the same language and being of the same religion, worshiping the same God, owing our redemption to the same Savior, and learning our duties from the same Bible, we shall not be treated as barbarians.
Wow, we're going to come over here and it gets longer. Sorry. Thank you.
We ask that having the same physical, moral, mental, and spiritual wants common to other members of the human family, we shall also have the same means which are granted and secured to others to supply those wants.
Thank you.
We ask the doors of the schoolhouse, the workshop, the church, the college shall be thrown open as freely to our children as to the children of other members of the community.
Wow, think about his experience in Rochester shaping that. Thank you.
We ask that the American government shall be so administered as that beneath the broad shield of the Constitution, colored American seamen shall be secure in his life, liberty, and property in every state and union.
These colored sailors move around different ports, and sometimes they face discrimination, not only in the south, but in the north. Thank you. We're going to go back here for the next line. We'll go back here.
We ask that as justice knows no rich, no poor, no black, no white, but like the government of God, renders alike to every man reward or punishment according to his works shall be. The white and the black man may stand upon an equal footing before the laws of the land.
Thank you. Next, over here.
Okay. We ask that since the right of trial by jury is a safeguard to liberty against the encroachments of power, only as it is a trial by impartial men drawn indiscriminately from the country, colored men shall not in every instance be tried by white persons, and that colored men shall not be either by custom or enactment excluded from the jury box.
Thank you. He's getting very specific in these lower ones, which is very interesting. And finally, bring us home.
We ask that insomuch as we are, in common with American citizens, supporters of the state, subject to its laws, interested in its welfare, liable to be called upon to defend in time of war, contributors to its wealth in time of peace, the complete and unrestricted right of suffrage, which is essential to the dignity even of the white man, be extended to the free colored man also.
Thank you. So we got voting rights, rights to trial by jury, equal schooling, equal access to work, equal standing. He is saying this is our country too. This is a confident Douglass who once again is telling not only Rochester but the world, this is the abolitionist movement that I lead and represent. Join me and we will revolutionize that world. Folks, it is no mistake he does that in Rochester, and that Rochester really does become, before and into the Civil War, Douglass is Rochester. So as you're heading around Mount Hope Cemetery and over at the University of Rochester today, really do think about Frederick Douglass stomping around these grounds and remaking Rochester just as he remakes the abolitionist movement in his image. Thank you so much.